Good evening. Welcome to St. George's House in Conversation. And we're delighted that so many of you are able to join us tonight for our conversation with Sir Mark Moody-Stuart, one of the UK's most distinguished business leaders. Sir Mark has worked across the globe, most notably with Royal Dutch Shell, and most recently on the boards of Saudi Aramco, Anglo American, Hermes, and indeed St. George's House. I could go on. He has been closely and importantly involved with the United Nations Global Compact Initiative for over 20 years, something we will definitely talk about later. And he has a long-standing involvement with and knowledge of China, a subject we shall also come to this evening. He has brought to the business world a focus on the linked areas of ethics and sustainability, and was described once as the preeminent corporate statesman and conscience of business. So Mark, thank you for joining us this evening. I've been reading your book on responsible leadership, and I want to take you back to your early years. You were born in Antigua, just as the Battle of Britain, 3,000 miles away, was coming to a head, and your father wanted to christen you Spitfire. So I think you had a lucky escape there, but more importantly, you could just as easily have become manager. You could just as easily have become manager of the family sugar factory, but you turned to geology. So tell us a little bit about those early years and the route that took you into geology.
Well, my father fought in the First World War and was sent by his father out to Antigua to look after some sugar estates, which my grandfather, who was a relatively poor Scot, had acquired. Complicated story. When I grew up, it was an idyllic life, although my eldest sister was already in England, and my brother, who'd had polio, was in England. So I didn't see them during the war. I first saw my eldest brother, who I was very fond of, at the age of 10. But I grew up with my second eldest brother and my sister, who's closest to me. And it was an idyllic life on a sugar plantation, going out and looking at sugar fields and riding horses and so on. And I said to my father when I suppose I was a teenager, he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd like to be a sugar planter just like you. And he said, forget it, basically. He said, the world is changing and it is time that we handed over things to the people of the island, basically. So he said to me, go and do something, find something else useful to do. And being at boarding school in England, I used to go along to the museums in London. I lived with my father's First World War spinster sisters in London, and they used to give me 2 bob and send me out to buy my lunch and entertain myself in the cinema or museums. And the Geological Museum was one I went to, and then I was at school in Shropshire, and Shropshire has beautiful geology. And I used to take samples into the Geological Museum, and they were extremely helpful. You could ask them what things were. And I remember taking a piece of what I thought was red siltstone in and asking. I was interested in the definition of grain size when it stopped being a sandstone, became a siltstone. So I asked the guy at the door about this, and he said, wait a minute. He got some luckless researcher to come and answer the question, who looked at it very carefully through his hand lens. And he said to me, it could be a siltstone, but actually it's part of a brick. But in not wishing to cast me down, he said, do you know how I know it's a brick? He said, it's very difficult to tell. He said, there's a little straight piece here, And that is actually part of the L of the London Brick Company, which was brilliant of him because he didn't put me down. He encouraged me and then showed me how he'd worked out that, because he might have been fooled. You can easily be fooled by a brick.
How interesting. And of course now geology and that interest has taken you all over the world. You and Judy have lived in or worked in at least 9 countries with Shell, and you've gone, as it were, from field work to boardroom. That has been the trajectory. And I know from your book that you loved being in the field and working hands-on geologist. Was it a difficult transition to management and to the senior levels of Shell?
Well, it's a sort of slow and progressive transition. I mean, Judy always says I married a field geologist, and my first 2 jobs were in the field and living in a tent for much of the time.
And where were they?
First in Spain, where I wasn't in a tent, but I had a driver and a land assistant and a Land Rover, Franco, Spain, and given complete responsibility. And then in the Oman mountains in the 60s, when Oman was a completely medieval country. But the transition really is, and I think it exists today. When you join a company with a technical background, you're part of a team and you bring your expertise to that team. So my 3rd job was in Borneo in Brunei as an exploration geologist, working in teams with seismologists and others. And you learn, each person in the team brings his or her expertise and you learn from the others. And then perhaps you progress to be the leader of a team, and you lead the team partly based on your expertise. Everyone in the team knows that you can probably do their job somewhere. And I then was through a number of other jobs and became a head of exploration teams in the North Sea. But at that point, you are definitely relying on your expertise and credibility. The next step was when I was sent back to Brunei. I asked Judy what she thought of it. She said, well, after 6 years in the real world, I could do with a burst of fantasy living in an oil camp in the tropics. I was responsible for engineering, maintenance, the transportation, docking tankers and so on, and logistics and supply. And the 3 people who reported to me, the youngest of them had joined Shell when I was 6. And every one of them knew that I could not do their jobs. So it's a completely different kind of leadership. You're basically there to remove obstacles and let them get on with the job. And that seems to have worked all right. And we developed a thing, and they were delighted if I could assist in dynamiting out of the way some problems. Right. Then when you get to the very top, it's an analogy is different. I used to say that going back to my childhood in the West Indies, it was a bit, my mother used to send my sister and I out to ride at the age of when I was 7 or 8. I was the 6th child, so I was probably quite expendable. And my sister is very tough and regards me as a bit of a wimp. And when we used to ride old estate horses, or sometimes pensioned off point-to-point kind of race horses. And when you're between sugarcane fields, these green alleys of, we call them barricadas, at the beginning of them, you had but to lift the reins of the horse and it exploded into action. And if you were lucky, you survived. But your job was to stop the animal going in the ditch or breaking a leg. And being at the top of a company, it's a bit like that. You are conducting an orchestra, but the creativity and energy comes from the people within it. And it's a question of how you guide the organization and stop some brilliant people driving the organization into the ditch by taking too big a risks or doing something inappropriate or whatever.
Right. Well, we will come back to leadership later in our conversation, but I was interested there that you mentioned Franco, because I think you were in Spain in the 60s. And one of the chapters in your book is headed Dining with the Devil, Engaging with Those Guilty of Human Rights Abuses. And you've had to deal with some pretty horrendous regimes. I'm thinking of Abacha in Nigeria, Assad in Syria, the father of the current president, the Iranians, apartheid in South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, of course. But perhaps there maybe are just two cases we might focus on particularly. Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria, because he was executed by the military regime shortly after you took the helm at Shell. And then, of course, Assad in Syria, whom you dealt with directly. I mean, how do you rationalize dealing with such disreputable regimes?
Well, I think at the time of Ken Saro-Wiwa's execution, I was part of the executive committee. I wasn't actually he who was in control of everything, but I had full responsibility for Nigeria. I think that to me the answer is communication. The Martin Luther King is said to have said that you cannot exert any moral suasion on someone for whom your contempt is absolute, or as it's seeking to connect with the humanity in a person, or as the Quakers would say, answering that of God in any man. In order to, you have to somehow establish some kind of human connection, and it's a very dangerous process because the question is who's influencing who, basically. I personally never met Sani Abacha, but I know Brian Anderson, who was our person in Nigeria. He's a friend over decades and was born in Nigeria. And I know Abacha was an extremely unpleasant person, and Brian would wait for hours and then get in at 3 a.m. with CNN going in the corner and so on. But he did have some connection. I mean, by that point, Abacha wouldn't even see the High Commissioner, I think. So the High Commissioner would ask Brian about what was going on. And I know Brian really felt almost soiled by it. When Assad, as you said, who was a person who in the 80s was guilty of shelling Hama and reportedly killing 20,000 people because he suspected them of harboring the Muslim Brotherhood. Assad was, in a way, quite a civilized person, in spite of all of that. When I first met him, and I saw him on numerous occasions because we had an important oil-producing business in Syria, and the first time I met him, I was told you have 30 minutes and that's it. You're out of there after that. And after 45 minutes, we hadn't got off religion. He was very interested in the Suryani Christians. And I remember the interpreter, who was a rather overweight fellow sitting on the floor, perspiring at having to translate all this stuff, Assad was explaining the argument among Christians was about, and the interpreter said it's about the material of Christ material of Christ's body. And Assad, who I know spoke English, said to the interpreter, substance. So he clearly knew the Nicene Creed. And you could talk to him, and I think it's a tragedy that power went to his son, and probably did not go to his son. It went to others who controlled his son, because Assad was gradually lightening things up, I think. But there, maybe I'm just, he was influencing me, not me him. But I think if you're going to do that, you have to have transparency with civil society organizations. I talked to human rights organizations, and they respected because I said, listen, if I tell you what we're talking about and you say we told Moody-Stuart to tell Assad this, I'll never see him again. But I think it is possible to have these sort of alliances, and also to try and for those external organizations to be in the back of your head to make sure that you are actually sticking to your principles, and that you're completely plain with the person you're talking to what your own organizations, your own and your organization's values are.
Right.
But you're not necessarily attacking. You're not attacking them.
Yeah.
Maybe
because we often
think of fight.
We often think of civil society and the corporate world as being polar opposites. But I think what I got from your book was that there was actually a lot of engagement with civil society, and in ways you could use each other. They could say things you couldn't say, and perhaps vice versa. Would that be right?
Oh, absolutely. In the case of the fight against corruption, that's absolutely essential, I think. And of course, the Shell business principles, which we set enormous store by, they were drafted by someone who was by Sir Geoffrey Chandler, later with Amnesty, in the 70s, in response to a corruption scandal in Italy. So what's new? We were very proud of the principles, but we applied them in quite they were well penetrated. And if you asked a Shell person what are Shell's principles, we'd say, we don't bribe people and we don't get mixed up in politics. And when, at the time of Sarawiwa's execution, and at the same time there was Brent's fire in the North Sea, plainly the world thought, whatever we thought of our principles, they weren't working. So being a rational sort of company, we held workshops all around the world, I think 80 of them, with 12 Shell people, 12 outsiders, journalists, civil society, politicians, others. And the question we asked them was, in the late 20th, going on 21st century, what are the responsibilities of a global corporation? And nobody, even our critics, refused to take part. And my summary of their answer was, it's an interesting question. Nobody has asked us before, and we're not sure we know the answer, but let's have a go. And out of that came modifications to the principles, one on human rights, on expressing respect for fundamental human rights. Had we had that before the Sarawiwa execution, people often say, what would you have done differently? And the answer is we called for, firstly, it was a surprise. Everyone was surprised. Nobody thought that he would be executed. Abacha was a psychopath, and he had, I learned afterwards that he had forgiven his predecessor, General Obasanjo, who was the first African military leader to hand over to civilian power voluntarily. A great man, in my opinion, and I was there in Nigeria when he did it. They had this whole, although we called for clemency and we asked for him to have a fair trial, we never actually said the trial is not fair. Everybody knew it wasn't fair. It was a military trial. And that was partly because deeply embedded in our psyche was a feeling that we were guests in the country and we should not interfere in politics. And the question is, how do you express your opinion without trampling on the territorial integrity, as it were, of the host country? It's very, but it's an important decision. And when we introduced the right and obligation to express support for fundamental human rights, we had a very interesting discussion with all our government partners, including the Chinese government partners.
Right. And it's interesting because when you say there about not getting involved in the politics of a country, but it seems to me it's almost inevitable. If it's a corporation the size of Shell, you can't avoid being political in some way.
And that's what our interlocutors said. We said, look, we don't get involved in politics. We don't get mixed up. We don't make political donations, which is part of the problem in the United States. We don't do that. And they said, it doesn't matter what you say. You are a political actor, inevitably. And that actually took me back to my second job in Brunei, where I remember having a discussion about the need to develop Brunei Malays along with the Chinese residents. And my boss then in Brunei said, but Mark, that's politics. And I remember saying to him, but not doing it is politics as well. And that's the point. And it took me rather a long time to realize that, I think. And it probably took Shell rather a long time. But I think we, and I still say we, have realized it. And if you read the current principles, it says the company has the right to express, and we have an obligation to express support, for example, for what we called fundamental human rights, which was where we got into an interesting discussion with the Chinese.
Right. And I suppose that leads me to the broader question of what governments and corporate business can or should do when faced with human rights abuses. Impose sanctions, withdraw from the offending country. Does either approach really work?
Well, I think my personal view is that a responsible company applying properly in its own operations proper values has a positive influence on the society in the country. The question is, does the government stop you doing this? Are they trying to, if the government forces you to do something against your principles, then I think there's no doubt that you should leave. But if they haven't done that, I still argue that there is a channel through which business can be a positive influence across even fractious political boundaries. For example, in Iran.
Yeah, I was interested. I was just going to ask you about a specific example of where that has worked for Shell, where good has been done while surrounded by often dubious activities by government.
Well, I think it very often they are individual cases where, I mean, for example, I remember in Malaysia a Malay, an ethnic Malay, originally from Indonesia, but a Malaysian citizen who was Christian, in Mahathir's mass arrests, was arrested to the horror. So one of our employees was arrested to the dismay of Chinese, Malay, all of whom knew him. And he was under detention, a leftover of our colonial system where you could detain people. The law under which it was a colonial leftover. And, you know, in that case, it was just continuously talking to the government and, you know, saying to Mahathir, look, the man is harmless. He's not doing anything, you know, it's got nothing to do with. And people, I remember the then chairman of Petronas, I said, I was in charge of Malaysia at the time, I've got the religious lot, authorities, telling me we should stop paying his salary. And the chairman of Petronas, who was of Malay, said, just ignore them. He said, just ignore them. I don't agree with that either. So I think, and then we had many years later, a young woman who was arrested in China and held again for about 18 months. And we had a system in Shell. I think every single encounter with the Chinese authority, be it ambassadors or otherwise, the obligation was to raise this issue. End of the meeting, beginning of the meeting, at some point say, what about this? Right. You have to have a trial. She has to be charged and tried, all the way up to Zhu Rongji. And the response was always, and we would say, we accept it's your responsibility, but we ask you to fix it. Mm-hmm. And in the end, they did. They did charge her, found her guilty, but of a minor crime. It was on information, yeah. And released her because she'd already been held for a long time, and she was able to go through Hong Kong to the States, and
yeah, good. And we will indeed
worked in the States for Shell until she retired.
Right. Great, and we will come back to China in just a moment, but I thought we should turn for a moment as well to the United Nations Global Compact, an initiative that was kick-started by Kofi Annan, and I know our listeners would be interested to hear what it is, how it works, and whether it's making progress.
Well, Kofi Annan in 1999 made a speech at Davos, in which he, at the World Economic Forum, at which he called on business to form a partnership with the United Nations to put a human face on global markets, and to do so by trying to embed in their day-to-day business the principles of the major UN conventions, so on human rights, on working conditions, and the environment. He also originally had in there a sentence on corruption. And we saw the speech beforehand, and I sat in the audience and listened. He'd asked a number of companies, if I say this, will you put your hands up and say we will do it? And we said, yes, we will. And there were 40 companies who did that. In the speech, as he actually delivered it, the paragraph on corruption wasn't there. So when I was asked to be on the panel on his advisory body for this organization, I said, yeah, but only on one condition, that you put corruption back. And Peter Eigen, the leader of Transparency International, did a lot of work. And Kofi Annan was actually probably right, because at that time, all the others had UN conventions. At that time, there was no UN convention against corruption until 2003. And in 2003, we put the so-called 10th principle on anti-corruption in that. So companies committed to it, to embedding the principles, but they didn't just do that. They had to sign up to report every year on it. We were criticized initially by civil society as being just words, people sign up and don't do anything. And we said, no, they do something. They have to report publicly, and you can review those reports, see whether they're right. And if they don't report, they will be delisted. And that's still so. We've delisted. There are now 12,000 business members, and we've delisted over the years several thousand. It makes progress. It's expanding quite rapidly at the moment. I think membership went up by about nearly 20% in the last year or so. Interesting impact of COVID. The COVID and other events. It has working streams on all sorts of different things, and now since 2015 introduces a commitment to support the progression of the Sustainable Development Goals. And no company can do it all, but you have to report whether you're doing something or not. You have to report on what you are doing and when you're going to do it and what progress you're making.
Okay, and let's just go back to China for a moment, because you've had a long, as I said earlier, you've had a long-standing interest and involvement with China, most recently in the area of renewable energy. But you've been going to China since the 1990s, and you write in your book about the lessons we might learn from China on the eradication of poverty, for example. And I wonder if you'd say something about that. I'm especially interested in your view of the movement of people and the hukou system that you write about.
It's an interesting example, and I was talking to some Chinese people attending university in the States about differences between systems. China has made huge progress in eradicating poverty, partly by connecting villages to the market. And an example of that was, and I had the honor of visiting with one particular, the person who organized the meetings I went to every year, which were started by Zhu Rongji. And we went on a field trip to look at poverty eradication. And you could see in an area in the southern mountainous part of Shaanxi province where they had built a road up the valley to connect the villages to the market. They'd made fiscal changes so that the farmers could profitably sell their product. But then beyond where they thought it economic to build a road, there were a couple of villages, and they simply moved those villages down onto the beginning of the road and arranged for those people to have access to some land. And the result was that people, including people who'd been moved, benefited and we saw someone who, and I discussed with my Chinese counterpart, how is this man who is, for the first 55 years of his life, he was in abject poverty, and now he's a mini capitalist. He's got a television set, 2 sofas. His wife has a semi-industrial bean curd thing. And yet this is partly through a system which to us would probably be unacceptable. Or you look at the Three Gorges Dam, when 1.5 million people will move. And the hukou system, I remember being in a meeting with Chinese ministers, and an elderly professor from Beijing University, Peking University, stood up and said, I think the hukou system, which assigns, rural, urban position, I think the hukou system is an offense against human rights. And at that time, human rights was not an expression in common use, shall we say. So there was silence. And he said, but I have seen the favelas and the slums of Latin America. That too is an offense against human rights. And he said, so in my opinion, control of people until we have the facilities and the infrastructure is the lesser of 2 evils. And I always say, and nobody's contradicted me yet, I think that China is the only country which has managed a transition, or is managing it, from a rural society to an urban society without the creation of slums. Now, it has had other collateral damage on children, for example. What happens, the children left behind. But I don't think you can say it's been an intrinsic evil.
Right.
I think it was well-intentioned and is considered by the Chinese as a rational approach to solving a problem, which they know needs to be solved.
And so, Mark, what about the China of today? Is it going to be the dominant world economy? And how should we best deal with the human rights issues? You look at the Uyghurs.
I think it is, and I think that's I think we have to be absolutely plain in expressing, and of course it depends when you start. The earlier you start expressing your views, so people know that that's what you think, is important. Just to go back to the Shell business principles, when we introduced these, we had in every country with our government partners to say, here's this expression that we and our partners will express support for fundamental human rights, as we put it. Will you sign up to it? And the Chinese came back, a lot of discussion, and because our partners were state-owned enterprises, and said, basically, here are 4 characters, which if you translate them, when I translate them or understand the translation, which, as you know, is not letter by letter, stands for human rights with a capital H and a capital R, and all the Western baggage. And they said, if that's what you want, the answer is no. However, there are 6 characters, including those 4, but plus 2, which if you translate them back, mean a respect for individual and personal rights. And we went to our human rights partners, as it were, civil society organizations, and said, look, we think this is progress, but we don't want you accusing us of watering down our principles. If a country like China, which is totalitarian, and the problem with which is that individual and personal rights are subservient to the states, if they're prepared to accept that, that to us is progress. And they, bless them, said, we agree, it's progress.
Good.
Many years later, I was talking to the woman who was still working for Shell, and I was reminding her of these 6 characters. And she said, Mark, and this was some years ago, she said, now you could use the 4 characters by themselves without the 2. And about 4 or 5 years ago, the local network of the Chinese local network of the UN Global Compact had of its own volition a workshop on human rights in China. Now, I don't know whether that would be possible nowadays, and that's a big question. But in my opinion, from 2000 onwards, certainly to 2015 or so, there was huge progress on this. Now, whether that progress has been reversed and whether it was always lurking there, I don't know.
Well, we're talking now just the day after a new president has been installed in the White House, and he plans to bring the US back into the Paris Accord. So I wonder, what future do you see for the extractive industries now in the climate change battle?
Well, the major energy companies are in a process of transition, inevitable transition. The transition would take place anyway, regardless of climate, but it would take place much too slowly. I mean, from the time I joined Shell, we always knew that we'd never burn all the coal, and the energy transitions that there had been through convenience, economy, and so on. And the technology was going to continue that. But it would not happen fast enough. It would happen in decades. And for the industry to acknowledge that it needs to change more rapidly has taken a long time. It will change. Whether major companies will be able to change fast enough, I don't know. But it'll be a very interesting. I know which ones I would bet on slightly more favorably than the others. The Europeans generally are in advance of the United States. Yeah. But it's going to be extremely tough for all of them.
And if it is going to change, it's going to require responsible leadership. And what skills, what qualities are the next generation of leaders going to need?
I think basically a quality which we've probably always needed, which is an ability to actually listen with curiosity to our critics, or to people who you don't agree with. Sometimes people who you think are foolish or have the wrong perceptions. It doesn't matter. It's their perception, and you better find out why is it. There's almost certainly something you've done which has given them this idea, and maybe they're actually right. And sitting down and listening and talking to them about it, I think you find that, to me, is the people have often asked me what I think is the most important thing to teach in business schools, which is not taught, which is to listen, and to listen to others, and in particular to those with whom you might not agree. And that applies, I hope President Biden takes that into account as well, because listening between countries, I think, and it's a bit back to dining with the devil, being clear on your principles, but listening, because a Chinese version of what's going on. I mean, I remember listening to John Bolton talking about how disgraceful it was that the Chinese should consider not only having an aircraft carrier, but actually putting it in the Mediterranean. And this was extremely aggressive. You sit there thinking, does this man never think that there's a huge fleet of US carriers off the coast of China. You think the population of China hasn't taken that? And what do they think? Now you say they're they're only there to protect Taiwan or something. Yeah.
But listening, I get that, and I'm sure I speak for our audience tonight when I say it has been an absolute pleasure listening to you. We're coming to the end of our time, so it really only remains for me, Sir Mark, to thank you for making the time, and indeed for sharing such fulsome and thoughtful insights. I'm very grateful. And thank you also to our audience out there in virtual land. I hope you've found this evening as stimulating as I have, and I hope you'll join us for future conversations in the coming weeks and months. But Sir Mark, we wish you and Judy well. And for now, from St. George's House, keep safe, keep well, and good night.
Thank you very much.